The man on the other side of the mat had 15 years on it. He was a Marine hand-to-hand instructor, 210 pounds, and none of it was soft. He stood with his weight even on both feet, his hands open at his sides, and he looked across the mat at the smaller man the way you look at a job you've already finished in your head. The smaller man weighed 138 pounds. No rank. No title on that base. He stood in his socks with his hands loose, and he was watching the big man's feet. The big man stepped in. He caught the wrist. He turned his hip. He dropped his weight, and the smaller man's feet left the floor. He went up and over and down, clean, the way a body goes over when the man throwing it has done it 10,000 times and outweighs it by 70 pounds. His back hit the mat, and 40 men around the edge of that mat let their breath out all at once. The smaller man lay there for half a second. The overhead light buzzed above him. Nobody moved. The big man stepped back, the way you step back after a clean throw, giving the other man room to stand. The smaller man got up. He rolled his shoulder once. He looked at the big man for a moment. Then he asked him to do it again. My father stood at the edge of that mat. He was close enough to hear the breath go out of both of them. He told me this story more times than I can count, and he always started it the same way. Not with a throw. With the shoes. The smaller man had taken his shoes off at the edge of the mat and set them down side by side, neat, toes pointed in, the way you'd set them down in your own home. My father said you could tell something about a man by how he took his shoes off in a room full of people who'd come to watch him lose. I'll tell you how my father came to be standing in that gymnasium. I'll tell you the year, and the base, and what the big man's record was, and why 40 Marines had given up an afternoon to stand around a wrestling mat under a buzzing light. But you already saw the part everybody remembers. The throw. The back hitting the mat. The exhale. My father spent 30 years telling me that was the least important thing that happened that day. Here is how he told it. The base was outside San Diego. The year was 1967, give or take a year. My father was never firm on the year, and he'd say so out loud, every time, before he told you anything else. What he was firm on was the room. A gymnasium. Concrete block walls painted the color of old teeth. A wrestling mat rolled out flat in the center of the floor. Overhead lights in steel cages, the kind that buzzed at a pitch you stopped hearing after a while, and then heard again whenever the room went quiet. And around the mat, maybe 40 men. Most of them Marines. Most of them young. Most of them in good shape, and most of them sure they already knew what hand-to-hand combat looked like, because they'd been doing it every week for as long as they'd been on that base. They had asked the smaller man to come and show them something. That was the whole arrangement. He moved through demonstrations and training films in those years, before the movies, before the name meant anything to anyone who didn't already know it. Word traveled in certain circles. And somebody on that base with enough pull to make it happen had gotten him to come down for an afternoon and put on a demonstration for the combat instructors. The instructors were not impressed in advance. My father said you could feel that the moment the smaller man walked in. 138 pounds of quickness was one kind of thing. A Marine who'd been taking men apart on a mat since before that quickness finished high school was another kind of thing entirely. The room had already decided which one of those was real, and which one was a show. Now here's the thing about the big man. He had a name, and my father knew it once, and lost it somewhere across 30 years of telling. He wouldn't invent one to fill the hole. So I won't either. In my father's telling, he was always just the instructor, or the big man, or the Marine. What my father kept was the record. 15 years on the mat. He had come up through the Corps when hand-to-hand was something you learned because you might actually need it, not as a line on a training schedule. He'd been in before Korea and he'd stayed in after, and somewhere in there he'd become the man they handed the new ones to. He trained the instructors who trained the recruits. On that base, if you learned to put another man on the ground without a weapon, you had learned it from him, or from someone he'd taught. He was 40-something. My father guessed 45, maybe a hard 40. 210 pounds. 6'1". Forearms, my father said, like the handles of tools. Not a bodybuilder's arms. A working man's arms, thick from 15 years of grabbing wrists and collars and hauling bodies through the air and onto the floor. And he had a way of standing. My father came back to this every time. The way the man stood, weight even, shoulders down, hands loose and open, never balled, because a man who's thrown 1,000 people doesn't need a fist to feel ready. He stood like the floor belonged to him and everyone else was a guest on it. He had never, as far as anyone on that base knew, been put down by a student. Probably not by an instructor either. Not in a long time. Maybe not ever. He'd agreed to spar light that day. To demonstrate a friendly exchange, the kind two competent men do slow and controlled in front of students, so the students can watch the shapes of it. Friendly. That was the word everyone used walking in. The big man rolled his neck once, side to side, and stepped onto the mat. And the smaller man, in his socks, with his shoes set down neat at the edge, stepped on to meet him. I want to stop here and tell you how my father got into that room, because the rest of this story doesn't land the way it's supposed to land if you think he was just some Marine in the crowd. He wasn't a Marine at all. My father worked a civilian job tied to that base in those years. The exact shape of it he always kept vague, and I've stopped trying to pin it down, because every time I tried, he'd wave it off like the job was the boring part, which to him it was. What mattered to him, what he wanted me to understand, was that he'd met the smaller men twice before, both times brief, both times through people they happened to both know. And the second time, the smaller man had said his name back to him. My father's name, remembered from the first time. He never got over that. A man who met that many people in that many rooms, and he'd held on to my father's name across the gap between two short meetings. So when word went around that there was going to be a demonstration on the base, my father found a reason to be in that gymnasium. He stood at the edge of the mat, and he watched a Marine instructor pick up a man he admired and put him flat on his back in front of 40 people. He told me, years later, with his hands flat on the kitchen table, and he only put his hands flat on the table when he wanted me to hear a thing and not just nod at it. He told me that for about 4 seconds, standing there, he was embarrassed. Not for himself. For the smaller man. He stood at the edge of the mat and felt his face go hot on behalf of someone he barely knew, because the room had wanted the smaller man to fall, and the smaller man had fallen. And then, my father said, those 4 seconds of embarrassment turned into 30 years of remembering, because of what the smaller man did next. Stay with me, because I'm going to slow this down to the speed my father slowed it down to. Back to the mat. They had circled first, before the throw. I skipped it, and I want to give it back to you, because my father never skipped it.
The big man came forward flat and heavy and patient. He didn't lunge. He didn't chase. 15 years had burned the hurry out of him. He moved the way water moves toward the lowest place in a room, slow, certain, in no rush, because it knows it's going to get there. The smaller man kept his weight back, on the balls of his feet, light. He didn't circle to look good. He circled to watch. And what he was watching, my father said, was not the big man's hands. It was the big man's feet. The whole time the room was watching two men move. The smaller man was watching where one man's weight went, and when. He put a hand out. Not a strike. A touch. A feeler, reaching into the space between them to find out what was there. And the big man caught it. That was all it took. The hand came out, the big man's fingers closed around the wrist, and 15 years did the rest. Hip turned. Weight dropped. The smaller man's base came off the floor before he could change his mind about the hand he'd offered. He went over. My father said it was so fast, and so clean, it almost didn't look like a fight at all. It looked like a demonstration of physics. Lever and fulcrum. A heavy thing moving a light thing through an arc it had no say in. The back hit the mat. And the room exhaled. I told you 40 men let their breath out at once. I want to be exact about the sound, because my father was exact about it, and the exactness is the whole point. It wasn't a cheer. Nobody hooped. These were Marines watching their own senior instructor do the thing he was best at. There was nothing surprising in it for them to celebrate. It was lower than a cheer and shorter. 40 men exhaling on the same beat. And underneath it, one short laugh from somewhere on the left side of the mat. Surprised. Almost relieved. Relieved. My father always landed on that word. Because the room had been carrying a question since the moment the smaller man set his shoes down neat at the edge of the mat. The question was, is he real or is he a show? And the throw had just answered it, and the answer the room heard was the answer the room had wanted walking in. He's a show. He can be put down. He's 138 pounds of quick, and quick goes over just like anything else when 15 years gets a hand on its wrist. The big man let go of the wrist. He stepped back. My father was clear about this, every single time, and he'd hold up one hand to stop me if he thought I was about to picture it wrong. The instructor was not gloating. His face barely changed. There was no triumph in him, because to him there was nothing to be triumphant about. He'd thrown 1,000 men. This was 1,001. He stepped back, and he gave the smaller man the floor to get up, the way you do, the way courtesy on a mat says you do. He waited for the smaller man to get up so they could bow and be done. That was supposed to be the end of the demonstration. Here's the thing about getting up off a mat. My father said you can read a whole man in how he stands up after he's been thrown. There's the fast way, the man who's been embarrassed and wants to erase it, who's up before his shoulders have finished landing, looking around to see who saw. There's the slow way, the man who's hurt, or who's pretending the slow is dignity when really it's pain. And there's a third way that my father said he'd only seen a few times in his whole life, and never as clearly as that afternoon. The smaller man got up like a man who'd just been handed something he wanted. Not fast. Not slow. He came up off the mat at the exact speed of someone who has just seen something interesting and intends to see it again. He got to his feet. He rolled his right shoulder once, the one that had taken the landing, testing it, noting it, the way you'd press a thumb against a bruise just to know exactly where it is. His face was calm. His breathing was even. He looked at the big man for a moment. And then he spoke. The words my father carried weren't exact, and he'd tell you that too. He wouldn't put quotation marks around a sentence he wasn't sure of. But the shape of it, he said, never changed in any telling he ever heard from anyone who was in that room. The smaller man looked at the instructor who'd just put him on his back in front of 40 people, and he asked to see it again. Not as a challenge. My father was specific and hard about this. There was no edge in it, no rematch in it, no let's see you do that twice. He didn't square up. He didn't reset his weight for a second go. He asked the way a student asks a teacher he respects. Show me that again. Slower. I want to see how you set it up. The big man looked at him. And for the first time that afternoon, my father said, the man who owned the floor didn't know what to do with the thing standing on it. I'll come back to the big man's face in a moment. I want to stay on that question, because it's the hinge the whole story turns on, and if you miss it, the rest is just a man getting thrown a few times on a base in California a long time ago. A challenge the instructor would have known what to do with. 40 men around a mat all knew what to do with a challenge. You square up. You go again. Someone wins it clearer the second time. The room gets a second answer, louder than the first. That's a language every man in that gymnasium spoke without thinking, the way you speak the language you were raised in. But the smaller man hadn't spoken that language. He'd asked to be taught. He had just been picked up and put flat on his back, cleanly, in front of everyone, by a man who outweighed him by 70 pounds, and the first thing out of him, once he was on his feet, was a request to see the thing that beat him. Slower. So he could understand it. He wanted the mechanism. He wanted to watch the throw with the speed taken out of it, the way you'd take a watch apart on a cloth to see what made the hands move. And there was nothing in that request a man could push against. No insult to answer. No pride to defend. Just a 138-pound man who'd been on the floor 10 seconds ago, asking politely to be put back on the floor again, slower this time, please, for the purpose of learning. That's where I'll pick it up, with the big man standing on his own mat, looking down at a guest who just turned a defeat into a request, and trying to find his footing on a floor that had, for the first time in 15 years, shifted slightly under him. The big man looked at him for what my father said was a long time, long enough that the room noticed it. 40 men had just exhaled. Now 40 men went quiet again, and this was a different quiet. The first quiet, before the throw, had been the quiet of people waiting to be proven right. This was the quiet of people who'd been proven right and didn't understand why the show wasn't over. The instructor stood there with his hands open at his sides. My father watched his face, and he said you could see the man running through it. A challenge he'd have answered in half a second. This he had to think about. Because to say no, to refuse to show a guest the thing he'd just done, would have looked like he was protecting something. And a man who'd thrown 1,000 people had nothing to protect, and knew it, and couldn't be seen to act like he did. So he nodded. He said something my father didn't catch, a word or two, to the smaller man, or maybe to the room. And then he reset his weight, even on both feet, and he said he'd show it slow. The smaller man stepped back into range. He set his feet. He brought his hands up, loose, open, the same as before. And then, my father said, he did the thing that he only understood the meaning of years later, when he'd had enough time to turn the afternoon over enough times. He offered the wrist again. The same hand. The same reach into the same space between them. The exact gesture that had gotten him thrown 10 seconds ago, he made again, on purpose, slowly, and he held it out there where the big man could take it. He was asking to be thrown the same way, so he could watch it happen to him at half speed. My father told me this part with his hands flat on the table. He said, "You have to understand what a strange thing that is to do. Most men spend their whole lives arranging things, so they never have to feel the thing that beat them a second time. A man gets thrown, he learns one lesson, and the lesson is don't put your hand out like that again. That's the normal lesson. That's the lesson the body wants to teach you fast, so it doesn't have to hurt twice." The smaller man had learned a different lesson, and the lesson was, "That hand told me something. Do it again so I can hear the rest of it." My father said he didn't have words for that the day it happened. He was a young man standing at the edge of a mat, embarrassed for someone, watching something he didn't have a frame for. It took him years. He said he'd be driving, or shaving, or sitting at this table, and the afternoon would come back to him, and each time he'd understand one more piece of why a man would offer his wrist to the thing that just threw him. And the piece he landed on, finally, the one he gave me with his hands flat on the wood, was this. The smaller man wasn't trying not to lose. He'd already lost. That was finished, that was spent, that cost him nothing more to look at. He was trying to learn. And those are two completely different men standing on a mat, even if they look identical from the edge. One is defending a thing. The other is collecting a thing. Now, back to the wrist, held out in the air, at half speed, in a silent room. The big man took it. Slowly this time. My father said the difference in speed changed everything you could see. The first throw had been one motion, too fast to break into parts. A hand, a turn, a body in the air, a back on the mat, done. This time the instructor walked through it. He closed his fingers around the wrist. He stepped his lead foot in and across. He began to turn his hip into the smaller man's center, the way you have to, because that's where the leverage lives, in the hip, in the turn, in getting your own weight under the other man's balance, and then taking that balance away. And while all of that was happening to him, slowly, the smaller man was watching the floor. Not the hands. Not the hip. The feet. The big man's feet. My father couldn't have known that at the time. He told me that honestly. From the edge of the mat, all he saw was a smaller man being walked through a slow throw, his head down, going along with it. It was only later, much later, from things the smaller man said, things that came back to my father across the years through the same circles that had put them in a room together, that he understood where the eyes had gone. The eyes had gone to the back foot. Because in any throw like that one, there is a moment. A single moment where the man doing the throwing has to commit his own weight before he can finish taking yours. He has to load. He has to put his balance somewhere in order to borrow yours. For a fraction of a second, the thrower is the one who is committed, the one who can't change his mind, the one whose own weight is now a fact on the floor that can be used.
The smaller man was looking for that moment. And at half speed, with the big man generously, patiently walking him through it to teach him, the smaller man got to watch the back foot load. He got to see exactly where, and exactly when, 15 years of throwing men put its weight down. Then he let himself go over again. His back hit the mat a second time. And this time, my father said, the room didn't exhale, because the room had already used that breath. There's nothing to release the second time. The first throw was a surprise that wasn't a surprise, the answer the room wanted. The second throw was just a man lying down where he'd already lain down once before. A few of the Marines shifted. Someone near my father muttered something. My father didn't catch the words, but he caught the tone, and the tone was, "What is this?" Not angry. Just confused. They'd come to watch a fight, or at worst a one-sided demonstration, and instead they were watching a small man volunteer to be put on the floor over and over by a big one, calmly, like it was a job he'd shown up to do. A few of them, my father thought, started to feel what he'd felt in those first 4 seconds. That low, hot thing. Embarrassment on behalf of a stranger. Because in the language those men spoke, a man who keeps getting thrown and keeps asking for more is a man who doesn't understand he's losing. And there's nothing harder to watch than someone who doesn't know he's losing. But the smaller man knew exactly what was happening. My father was sure of that, sure of it for the rest of his life. The smaller man knew precisely the price of what he was doing, and he decided the price was cheap because he was buying something the rest of the room couldn't even see was for sale. He got up the same way the second time. Calm. Even. He rolled the shoulder again. He looked at the big man. And my father, watching from the edge, felt his stomach drop, because he knew what was coming. The smaller man was going to ask for it a third time. I want to tell you about a thing that happened at our kitchen table, years after my father started telling me this story, because it changed how I heard the rest of it, and I think it'll change how you hear it too. I was maybe 16, old enough to think I'd heard all his stories. He told the math story again. He told it dozens of times across my childhood, the way some fathers tell the same war story or the same fishing story. And that night, 16 years old and full of myself, I interrupted him. I said something like, "So he lost. He got thrown 3 times. Why is this the story you keep telling? He lost." My father didn't get angry. He did something worse. He got quiet, and he looked at me across the table for a moment, and then he asked me a question. He said, "When you were learning to ride your bike, and you fell, do you remember what you did?" I said I didn't remember. He said, "I do." He said, "You fell, and you got up, and the first thing you did, every single time, before you even brushed yourself off, was you turned around and looked at the spot where you fell. Every time. You wanted to see what got you. You were 3 years old, and nobody taught you to do that. You just did it." He said most kids cry and look at their hands. You looked at the ground. And then he said, somewhere between 3 and 16, most people stop doing that. They fall, and they look at their hands, and they decide the ground is the enemy. He said the man on that mat never stopped doing the thing you did at 3. He fell, and he turned around, and he looked at exactly what got him. 3 times. In front of 40 men who were embarrassed for him. Because looking at what got you is worth more than your pride. If what you're after is getting better, and worthless if what you're after is looking good.
He said, I keep telling you this story because I'm trying to get you to keep looking at the ground.
I'm 40-some years old now, and I still think about that.
Back to the mat. Before I give you the third throw, I have to tell you about the big man's hands, because my father noticed something about them that afternoon, and he carried it for 30 years without ever quite knowing what to make of it, and I'm not sure I know either. I'm just going to set it down here the way he set it down for me.
The instructor had a habit, between exchanges, when he stepped back to give the smaller man room to stand, his right hand would open and close. Once, sometimes twice.
Not a fist of anger. My father was clear it wasn't that. It was slower than that, and more thoughtful, like a man flexing a hand that had done a lot of work over a lot of years, and was checking, out of long habit, that it still closed the way it was supposed to. My father said he'd watched a lot of men's hands in his life. That was part of the vague civilian job he wouldn't fully explain, and he'd learned that a man's hands tell you things his face is trained to hide. The face stays still. The hands keep their own counsel, and sometimes let it slip. After the first throw, the big man's hand opened and closed once. Easy. Habit. Nothing in it. After the second throw, my father watched the hand again. It opened and closed twice. He didn't know what that meant. He's gone now, and I never got to tell him I'd put it in a story, and I still don't fully know what it meant. But I know my father thought it meant something, because he mentioned that hand every single time he told this, and a man doesn't repeat a detail across 30 years unless some part of him is still turning it over, still waiting for it to finish telling him what it was trying to say. Hold on to the hand. We'll come back to it. The smaller man got to his feet for the second time and looked at the instructor, and my father braced himself for the third request. But here's where it stopped going the way the room expected, and started going the way only the smaller man expected. Because the third time, he didn't ask to be thrown. He asked the big man to come at him. Same calm, same even voice. No edge in it, my father said, still no edge, but the shape of the request had changed, and everyone close enough to hear it felt the change. The first two times, the smaller man had offered himself up. Throw me. Show me. Slowly. He'd been the student, the willing body, the thing being moved. This time he asked the instructor to initiate, to come forward and take him the way he'd take a man who wasn't volunteering. Real speed, not a demonstration. Not slow. He'd seen the throw done to him twice. He'd watched the back foot load at half speed. And now he was asking to see it one more time, but live, at full speed, with the big man genuinely trying to put him down, because the slow version had given him the map, and now he needed to see the thing move at the speed it would actually move at. My father said the instructor's face finally changed. Not much. The man had 15 years of stillness built into that face. But something moved behind it. Because this third request was different in a way even the room could feel, and the difference was this. The first two throws, the smaller man had been learning the shape of the technique. This third time, he was asking to test something. He'd found something in those slow throws. Something at the back foot. And now he wanted to see it at speed, to find out if the thing he found was real, or just a trick of slow motion. The big man rolled his neck once, side to side, the way he had at the very start.
He set his weight even on both feet.
And for the third time that afternoon, the two of them squared up on the mat, except this time, my father said, for the first time, it was the smaller man who looked ready, and the big man who looked like he was being asked a question he hadn't been asked in 15 years. What happened next is the part my father slowed all the way down. So I'm going to stop here, with both men set, the room dead quiet, the hand that had opened and closed twice now closed around nothing, waiting. And I'll give you the third exchange in full.
They squared up.
And then nobody moved. My father said this was the longest stretch of the whole afternoon. The two throws had been fast, one of them so fast it was over before the room understood it had started.
But this third setup, the two men just stood there, and the stillness stretched, and the buzzing of the overhead lights came back into everyone's ears the way it does when a room goes completely quiet. The big man waited.
The smaller man waited. And my father, watching from the edge, understood something he couldn't have put words to until much later. The big man was used to being the patient one. 15 years had taught him that you don't chase. You let the other man come, you let the other man commit, and you take what he gives you. Patience was his whole game. He'd beaten 1,000 men by being the one who didn't move first.
But the smaller man wasn't moving either.
And that was a problem, because the smaller man had asked the big man to initiate, to come forward. He'd put it on the instructor to be the one who closed the distance.
And now the instructor was standing on his own mat, in front of his own students, having agreed to attack, and discovering that the moment he came forward, he'd be the one committing his weight. He'd be the one loading the back foot. He'd be the one whose balance became a fact on the floor. He'd spent his whole life letting other men make that mistake.
Now he'd agreed to make it himself. I'll be honest with you about something here, because my father was always honest about it, and the honesty is part of the story.
My father did not understand, standing at the edge of that mat, what he was watching. I keep telling you what the smaller man was doing, watching the back foot, finding the moment of commitment, turning the third exchange into a trap. And all of that is true, but almost none of it was visible to a young man standing in a crowd in 1967. What my father saw, in the moment, was two men standing very still for an uncomfortably long time. That's all. The meaning came later, in pieces, across 30 years.
I'm giving you the meaning early because I'm telling it after the fact, and I know where it goes. My father had to live it forward, blind, the way we all live everything. He just had the good sense to keep turning it over until it gave up what it meant. So when I tell you the big man had walked into a trap, understand that nobody in that room would have called it a trap. They'd have called it two men hesitating. The trap only became a trap in hindsight, which is the only place most traps ever become visible. Now, the big man came forward. He came the way he'd come the first time. Flat, heavy, patient even in motion, water finding the low place. He reached for the wrist, because that had worked twice, because that was the throw, because why change a thing that had put this man on the mat 2 times already? And the wrist wasn't there. My father said it was the first fast thing the smaller man had done all afternoon. Every other motion had been calm, even, unhurried, the slow offering of the hand, the slow getting up, the rolling of the shoulder. But when the big man reached for the wrist this third time, at full speed, the smaller man's hand was simply gone. It didn't pull back in fear.
It didn't flinch away. It just wasn't where the big man's 15 years told him it would be.
And the big man's weight was already moving.
That's the thing. That's the whole thing. He committed. He'd stepped in, he'd reached, he'd begun the turn of the hip, he'd loaded the back foot, exactly where and exactly when the smaller man had watched him load it twice before at half speed. The big man's balance was now a fact on the floor, and the wrist that was supposed to give him the leverage to take the smaller man's balance away, the wrist was gone. For a fraction of a second, the most dangerous man in that gymnasium was standing on a committed back foot with nothing to throw. The smaller man took the back foot. My father couldn't tell me exactly how. He said it happened at the one speed his eyes couldn't break apart, and he'd watched the slow throws precisely so he could compare, and he still couldn't break this one apart. There was a low motion, a drop. The smaller man went down and in toward the very foot that carried all of the big man's loaded weight, and he did something to it. A hook, a sweep, a press. My father never knew the name and wouldn't pretend to. And the foot that 15 years had taught to be the anchor became the thing that wasn't there. And the big man went down. Not thrown. That's the distinction my father drew, every time, and drew hard. The big man wasn't thrown. He wasn't picked up and put over the way he'd put the smaller man over twice. He went down because the floor stopped being where he'd left his weight. He went down the way a man goes down when the ground he was standing on is suddenly, briefly, not under him, heavily, with no arc to it. Straight down and slightly back, the 210 pounds finding the mat all at once. The mat boomed. My father said that was the sound. Not the clean slap of the smaller man's back hitting the mat. That sharp, light sound the room had heard twice. This was lower and bigger. A boom. 210 pounds of Marine instructor meeting the floor with all of his weight and none of his preparation. And the room did not exhale. The room made no sound at all. Here's what I remember most about how my father told this part. He'd get to the boom, the big man hitting the mat, and people who didn't know my father, people he told this to once, would lean in here. Because this is the part that sounds like the payoff. The small man beats the big man. The 138-pound demonstration artist puts the 210-pound Marine instructor on the floor in front of 40 of his own people. That's the moment, right? That's the story? My father would watch them lean in, and then he'd tell you, flatly, that this was not the point of the story, and he'd watch them deflate a little, every time, and he never once softened it for them. Because the smaller man didn't celebrate. He didn't stand over the big man. He didn't look at the room to see who'd seen. My father said the smaller man did something almost no one in that gymnasium understood, and it was the thing that finally made my father stop being embarrassed for him and start being something else, something closer to awe, though my father would never have used a word that big. The smaller man put his hand out to help the big man up. The big man on his back on the mat. The room silent. And a 138-pound hand extended down toward him, open, offering to help him to his feet. My father said the whole afternoon lived or died in the next 2 seconds, and he held his breath through them, because there were 2 ways this could go, and only one of them was any good. The big man could refuse the hand. He could get up on his own, hard and fast, the way a proud man does, and square up, and turn this into the thing it had been carefully not being all afternoon, a real fight, between a senior Marine instructor who'd just been humiliated on his own mat and a smaller man who'd just done the humiliating.
40 Marines were standing right there. My father said the air had that thing in it. The thing that's in a room right before it decides which way it's going to go.
Or, the big man could take the hand. My father watched the instructor's face from the edge of the mat. He watched the man lying on his own mat, in front of his own students, having been put down by a guest a third his weight in expertise and 70 pounds in body. He watched the right hand, the hand that had opened and closed once after the first throw, twice after the second. And the right hand reached up and took the smaller man's hand. The smaller man pulled him to his feet. And the big man stood there for a moment, and my father said this was the moment the entire story had been walking toward, and almost nobody in that room knew it, because it didn't look like anything. It looked like two men standing on a mat. One had just gotten up off the floor. The other had just helped him. That's all the room could see. But my father was close, and my father was watching the big man's face.
And he said that the instructor looked at the smaller man, looked at him the way you look at a thing you've been getting wrong, and then the instructor did something my father had not seen him do all afternoon, through 3 throws and 2 of his own, through 15 years of stillness built into that face. The big man laughed. Not a big laugh. Short, quiet, more breath than sound. But it was a real one, and my father said it broke something open in the room, because 40 Marines had been holding a tension they didn't have a name for, and the senior man, the man whose floor it was, the man who'd just been put down, he was the one who let it go first. He laughed, low and short, looking at the smaller man, and the look on his face, my father said, was the look of a man who has just been shown the back of his own hand. The thing he'd been doing for 15 years, that he could do in his sleep, that he'd never had to look at because it always just worked. Somebody had just turned it around and shown it to him from the other side. And here's the thing my father always said next, and it's where I'll stop, because everything left in this story hangs off it. He said, the smaller man hadn't beaten him. He said, the smaller man had shown him something, and the difference between those two, beating a man and showing a man, was the whole reason my father told this story for 30 years. The big man was still holding the smaller man's hand. 40 Marines were still silent. The lights were still buzzing. And the instructor was about to say the thing that my father carried to the end of his life. The instructor was still holding the smaller man's hand. And then he said the thing my father carried to the end of his life. He said, and again, my father wouldn't swear to the exact words. He never would, but the shape of it held across every telling. He said, nobody's done that to me on this mat. He said it in front of 40 of his own men, the man who'd run that floor for 15 years, and there was no shame in how he said it. My father said that was the astonishing part. A lesser man would have explained it away. A slip, a lucky angle, a trick that wouldn't work twice. The instructor didn't reach for any of that. He just said the true thing, plainly, the way you report the weather. Nobody's done that to me on this mat. And then he asked the smaller man how he'd done it. I want to be careful here, because this is the moment the whole video has been walking toward, and I've watched people get it wrong when I've told it out loud. They think the payoff is the sweep. The small man taking the big man's foot. The boom on the mat. They think that's the thing. It isn't. The payoff is the question. 210 pounds of Marine instructor, 15 years on that mat, never put down by a student, and the thing he did, the second he was back on his feet, was ask the smaller man to teach him. He turned the whole afternoon inside out. The room had come to watch a guest get schooled, and it ended with the schooled man being asked to be the teacher by the one person in that gymnasium with the standing to refuse to learn anything from anyone. My father said that was when he understood what he'd actually watched. Not a fight. A trade. The smaller man had let himself be thrown twice, paid for something, on purpose, in front of people, with his own pride as the currency, and what he'd bought was one piece of information about a back foot. And then he'd spent that information once, cleanly, and immediately handed it back across an open palm to the man he'd taken it from. He hadn't come to win. He'd come to learn, and to teach, and the throwing and the sweeping and the booming on the mat were just the language the two of them happened to speak. And here's where my father always brought back the hand. I told you about it early. The instructor's right hand, that opened and closed once after the first throw, twice after the second. My father had watched it all afternoon without knowing why it mattered. When the smaller man pulled the big man to his feet, when the big man said nobody's done that to me on this mat, my father was watching the hand again, out of habit by then, and he said the hand did something it hadn't done all afternoon. It stayed open. The big man stood there with his right hand open at his side, and it didn't close. Not once. And my father said he didn't understand it in the moment, but he understood it later, the way he understood everything later. He said a man's hand closes when he's holding onto something. Readiness. Pride. The next throw. The need to be the one who wins. 15 years, that hand had been closing and opening, holding the floor, holding the certainty, getting ready for the next man. And a 138-pound man had just opened it. Not by beating him. By showing him there was something he didn't know on his own mat after 15 years, and that the not knowing wasn't a wound. It was a door. My father said the open hand was the instructor setting down something he'd been holding so long he'd forgotten he was holding it. I don't know if my father read too much into a hand. I'll be honest about that. He was a man who watched hands, and sometimes a man who watches hands sees things that are really only in himself. But he told me about that open hand for 30 years, and I've decided I believe him, because the thing he saw in it is true whether or not the hand actually did it. The smaller man opened people. That was the whole point of him. So the smaller man showed him. Right there on the mat. He didn't make a speech of it. My father said he stepped back into range, and he had the big man come forward again, slow, and this time the smaller man narrated it with his body, showed him where the weight went, showed him the moment of commitment on the back foot, the fraction of a second where the thrower borrows his own balance against himself. He showed the instructor the thing the instructor had been doing blind for 15 years, the small structural truth buried inside his own best technique, the place where the strength turned, for one instant, into the weakness. And the big man, my father said, watched it the way the smaller man had watched the first two throws. Head down. Eyes on the feet. Learning. 2 men on a mat, taking turns being the student. 40 Marines around the edge, dead silent, watching something none of them had a word for. The lights buzzing. And my father at the edge, 20-some years old, feeling the hot embarrassment of the first 4 seconds turned all the way over into the thing it stayed for the rest of his life. He told me he stopped being embarrassed and started being grateful. That's the word he used. Grateful. That he'd found a reason to be in that gymnasium. That he'd watched a man take a defeat and turn it, in front of everyone, into the most generous thing in the room.
There's a part of this I have to tell carefully, because my father told it carefully, and because it's the part where the afternoon stopped being about two men on a mat and became about my father, and then, eventually, about me. When it was over, when the demonstration broke up, when the 40 Marines started talking again, and the room filled back up with the ordinary noise of men, my father didn't go up to the smaller man. He wanted to. He had a reason to. They'd met twice. The man knew his name. But he didn't. He said he stood at the edge of the mat and watched the smaller man put his shoes back on. The same shoes he'd set down neat at the start. He sat on the edge of the mat and put them on, one at a time, and tied them. And my father said there was something about watching a man who'd just done all of that simply put his shoes back on like any other afternoon. He didn't finish that sentence. He never finished it in 30 years. He'd started. There was something about watching him put his shoes back on, and then he'd stop and look somewhere past me and let it sit. And I let it sit too. I'd come to think the unfinished sentence was the most honest thing in the whole story. Some things you carry don't have an end to them. They just have a shape you keep your hands around. I'll tell you the last thing the instructor did, because my father saw it, and then I'll bring us home. Before the smaller man left, the big man walked over to him. The instructor. 210 pounds, 15 years, the open hand. He walked over, and he put that hand out, and the two of them shook, and the big man said something quiet that my father was too far away to hear. But he saw the smaller man's face when he heard it. And my father said the smaller man, who'd been calm all afternoon, calm through 3 throws, calm through the sweep, calm pulling a man twice his expertise up off the floor. The smaller man heard whatever the instructor said, and he smiled. A real one. The kind that gets away from you before you can arrange it. My father said it was the only moment all day the smaller man looked surprised. Not by the throws. Not by anything that happened on the mat. By whatever a Marine combat instructor said to him quietly while shaking his hand at the end. My father never knew what it was. He'd have given a lot to know. I would too. It's the one piece of this story with no answer in it, and I've made my peace with that, because I think a story needs one of those. One door it doesn't open. One thing the man at the edge of the mat didn't get to hear, so that the rest of us have to lean in toward it forever. That's where the afternoon ends. But it isn't where the story ends, because the story didn't really belong to that gymnasium. It belonged to a kitchen table years later, and to a man who put his hands flat on the wood when he wanted his son to listen. My father told me this story for the last time about a year before he died. I didn't know it was the last time. You never do. We were at the kitchen table, the same table. He never replaced it, and it was late, and I was a grown man with my own kids by then, and he started telling it the way he'd started telling it my whole life. With the shoes. Always the shoes. The smaller man set his shoes down neat at the edge of the mat, toes pointed in a room full of people who'd come to watch him lose. And I let him tell all of it. The circling. The first throw. The exhale of 40 men. The request to see it again. The second throw, with no exhale left in the room. The hand that opened and closed once, then twice. The third exchange, the stillness, the back foot, the boom on the mat. The open hand that stayed open. The instructor asking to be taught.
the shoes going back on. The quiet thing said at the end that my father never heard.
I'd heard it 100 times. I let him tell it like it was the first.
And when he got to the end, he put his hands flat on the table. And he told me why he'd told it to me so many times. He'd never quite said it straight out before. That night he said it straight out, and I think some part of him knew, even if I didn't. He said, "I never wanted you to be the big man." I thought he meant something about size, or fighting, and he saw me think it, and he shook his head. He said, "The big man wasn't the villain. That's what people get wrong when I tell it. They think the big man's the one who lost, so he must be the one who did something wrong. He didn't do anything wrong. He was the best at his thing for 15 years, and he earned every bit of it. The only thing wrong with the big man, and it wasn't even wrong, it was just human, was that he'd been the best for so long he'd stopped being thrown. And a man who stops getting thrown stops looking at the ground. And a man who stops looking at the ground stops learning what's down there." He said, "I didn't want you to be the big man, not because the big man was bad. Because the big man was good, and comfortable, and certain, and that's the most dangerous thing a person can be. Certain." He said certainty is just the thing you feel right before someone takes your back foot. And then he said the thing I've carried since. He said, "Be the small man. Take the shoes off neat. Get thrown. Look at the ground. And when you finally figure out the thing that's been beating you, when you finally take somebody's back foot clean, put your hand out and help them up and teach them how you did it. Because winning's nothing. Anybody can want to win." He said the small man didn't come to win. He came to learn and to give it away. And in his whole life, my father said, that was the only kind of person he'd ever really respected. The ones who learned in order to give it away. I thought about why that afternoon, out of a whole life, was the one my father kept. He had a long life. He had a war he didn't talk about, and a marriage he did, and work he was good at, and friends and losses, the ordinary full freight of a person. And out of all of it, the thing he handed me, over and over, hands flat on the table, was 45 minutes in a concrete gymnasium in 1967 that he wasn't even sure of the year of. I think it's because it was the day he saw, clean and complete, the kind of man he wanted to be, and knew, even at 20-some, watching from the edge, that he probably wouldn't fully manage it. None of us fully manage it. The small man on the mat was a kind of person so rare my father saw it once, all the way, and then spent the rest of his life trying to point his son toward it. Look! There. That's the thing. I can't quite be it. Maybe you can get closer. I don't know if I have. I get certain. I stopped looking at the ground. I hold things in my hand so long I forget I'm holding them. I catch myself being the big man more often than I'd like to admit, and I'm telling you that honestly, because my father was honest about what he didn't manage, and I owe you the same. But I tell my kids about the shoes now. Set them down neat. Get thrown. Look at the ground. And it occurs to me, saying it to them, that this is the throw, that a story is the only thing a person can hand across a kitchen table that the next one can pick up and hand across the next table, and the next, the back foot of one generation becoming the open hand of the next. Here's the part one never got. What the instructor said at the end. The quiet thing, while they shook hands, that made the small man smile, the one real surprised smile of the whole afternoon. My father stood 20 feet away and didn't hear it, and wanted to for 60 years,
and died not knowing. And I've decided I'm glad. Because I've watched people lean toward the gap every time I tell this, the same way you probably just lean toward it. We want the missing piece. We want the door opened. And the wanting is the whole inheritance. My father handed me a story with one thing he couldn't give me, and the not having of it has kept me turning the whole thing over for 40 years, exactly the way the open hand kept turning over in him, exactly the way the small man kept turning over what beat him. The gap isn't a flaw in the story. The gap is the engine of it. It's the reason it's still moving, 3 tables down from a gymnasium nobody can name the year of. So I'm going to leave it where my father left it. One door I won't open. One quiet thing said between 2 men on a mat a long time ago that made the smaller one smile, that I'll never know, and that you'll never know, and that the 2 of them took with them. I'll only tell you the last thing my father said that night at the table, the last time, before I knew it was the last time. He took his hands off the wood, and he looked at me, and he said the thing he'd been circling the whole story, the whole 30 years. He said, most people fall down and look at their hands. He said, I'm asking you to look at the ground. And then he got up, the slow, careful way he got up by then, and he put his chair in, neat, toes pointed in, and he said good night, and he went to bed. So that's the story? The man who let himself be thrown twice to learn one thing, sped it once, and gave it back across an open hand. The instructor who was good enough to be made certain, and great enough to set the certainty down when a stranger showed him a door. My father at the edge of the mat, embarrassed for 4 seconds and grateful for 60 years. And a kitchen table where a thing got handed from one set of hands to the next. If you've got somebody, a kid, a younger version of somebody, anybody who's still deciding what kind of person they're going to be, I'd tell you to tell them about the shoes. Set them down neat. Get thrown. Look at the ground. Find the back foot. And when you find it, put your hand out. And if there's a story your father told you 100 times, that you rolled your eyes at, that you only half listened to, I'd go find it, if I were you. While you can still ask him which year it was. Mine couldn't remember the year either. But he never once forgot the shoes.